In the depths of a medieval palace, where torchlight flickers against cold stone walls, a young prince's cries echo through chambers that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires. But these are not the tears of a prisoner of war, nor the anguish of a captured enemy. These screams belong to a son, tortured by his own father, the king power, they say, corrupts absolutely. But what happens when that corruption turns inward, when the very bloodline meant to secure a dynasty becomes its greatest threat? In the shadowed halls of history's most notorious palaces, we uncover a truth so dark, so unthinkable, that it challenges everything we believe about the sacred bonds between father and son. For centuries, kings ruled by divine right chosen by God, blessed with absolute authority, their bloodlines sacred and untouchable. Yet beneath the gilded crowns and behind the tapestried walls, a different story unfolds. A story where succession became a curse, where heirs were not blessings but harbingers of doom, where the greatest enemy a king could face was not a foreign invader or rebellious noble, but his own child. The medieval mind was consumed by one terrifying obsession, the preservation of power. Every king knew that his throne was temporary, that death would eventually claim him, and that his legacy would pass to another. But what if that heir became impatient? What if the son decided not to wait for nature to take its course? What if the very act of producing an heir was signing one's own death warrant? In the Byzantine Empire, fathers looked upon their sons not with pride, but with suspicion. In the Ottoman courts, brothers were eliminated before they could threaten the succession. In the palaces of medieval Europe, paranoia infected every royal bloodline like a hereditary disease, passed down through generations along with crowns and scepters. The mathematics of monarchy were simple and brutal. There could be only one king, and every prince was a potential usurper. The closer the blood relation, the greater the threat. A distant cousin might rebel, but a son had the strongest claim of all. A son could wait, could gather support, could whisper in corridors and count allies. A son was patient, calculating, inevitable. And so, even the son of a king was never truly safe, because his very birth was a threat. But suspicion, once planted, grows like poison ivy through the corridors of power. In the paranoid minds of medieval monarchs, every glance from a son became a challenge, every word a potential plot, every smile a mask concealing treacherous ambition. History is littered with the bones of royal fathers and sons who turned against each other. Their love curdled into hatred, their trust transformed into deadly suspicion. Henry II of England watched his sons, the very princes he had groomed for greatness, raise armies against him. Richard and John, names that would echo through history, first learned the art of war not against foreign enemies, but against their own father. The old king's paranoia was not without foundation. Medieval princes often did plot against their fathers. Youth was impatient, and power was intoxicating. Why wait for a natural death when an arranged accident or a well-timed rebellion could accelerate the process? The courts of Europe buzzed with whispered conspiracies. Sons counting their father's grey hairs like a miser counts coins, measuring each cough, each moment of weakness. In the Holy Roman Empire, emperors learned to sleep with one eye open. The Ottoman sultans institutionalized their fear, creating laws that not only permitted but required the elimination of potential rivals. Brothers, sons, nephews, all were fair game in the deadly chess match of succession. The Turkish proverb spoke truth. The empire cannot be governed by two sultans. But what happened when suspicion outpaced reality? When paranoid kings began to see treason in places where none existed? The Byzantine Emperor Basil I, consumed by fear, suspected his own son Leo of plotting against him. The evidence was thin, a conversation here, a gathering there, the natural ambition of a young prince. But thin evidence was often enough for thick suspicion. In the candlelit chambers where kings held court, every loyal son learned to walk on eggshells. A word spoken too boldly could be interpreted as insubordination. A friendship with a noble could be seen as coalition building. Even silence could be read as sullen plotting. The sons of kings found themselves trapped in an impossible game: show too much interest in politics and be labeled a conspirator, show too little and be accused of disrespect. The most tragic cases were those where sons remained genuinely loyal, where love and duty still flickered in their hearts despite their father's growing madness. These princes watched helplessly as paranoia consumed the men they had once admired, as the loving fathers of their childhood transformed into suspicious tyrants who saw enemies in their own blood. But suspicion alone was enough to light the torches of the dungeon. Beneath every great palace lay another kingdom, a realm of shadows and screams where the instruments of royal justice waited in patient silence. Iron maidens stood like metallic coffins, their spike-lined interiors hungry for flesh. Stretching racks gleamed with oil and anticipation. Red-hot irons glowed in braziers, ready to brand and burn and blind. These were not the tools meant for common criminals or enemy spies. These chambers had been prepared for princes, sons of kings, heirs to thrones. The very blood that should have been most sacred became the most targeted for profane torture. The art of royal torture was refined over centuries, perfected by kings who needed their heirs to suffer but survive, to be broken but not killed, at least not immediately. Death was too merciful, too quick to final. The goal was not execution but education, to teach the lesson that even royal blood could be spilled, even divine lineage could be corrupted, even the most privileged sons were nothing more than subjects before an absolute monarch. Blinding was a favorite technique of Byzantine emperors. The logic was cruel but practical. A blind prince could never effectively rule, could never lead armies, could never truly threaten the throne. Yet he could live a constant reminder of royal mercy and royal power. The red-hot iron, pressed against the eyes of a son, sent a message that echoed through every palace corridor. This is what awaits those who forget their place. The psychological torture was often more devastating than the physical. Princes were confined in towers for years, decades even, watching through barred windows as the world moved on without them. They were fed just enough to survive, given just enough light to prevent madness, maintained in a state of suspended animation between life and death. The Ottoman princes knew this fate well. Brothers locked away in the cafes, the cage, their lives preserved, but their spirits systematically destroyed. Starvation was another tool in the arsenal of royal cruelty. Not the quick death of total deprivation, but the slow agony of calculated malnutrition. Enough food to prevent death, but never enough to restore strength. Mughal emperors were masters of this technique, watching their sons waste away in palace prisons, their bodies shrinking even as their hatred grew. Some kings preferred the intimacy of personal involvement. They did not delegate their children's torture to professional torturers or castle guards. Instead, they rolled up their sleeves and participated directly, as if the act of causing pain to their own flesh and blood was a sacrament of power, a ritual confirmation of their absolute authority. The instruments themselves became symbols of royal power. The iron crown that burned the scalp, the golden chains that cut into royal wrists, the silk cords that slowly strangled without leaving marks. Every tool was crafted to send a message. Even luxury could become torment. Even symbols of royalty could become instruments of agony. Each scream was a crown secured, and each mutilation a kingdom's cruel insurance policy. In the stone towers of medieval England, Prince Henry, the young king, learned that rebellion carried a price higher than death. His father, Henry II, did not simply defeat his son's armies, he broke the young man's spirit with systematic psychological torment. Confined, isolated, forced to watch as his supporters were executed one by one, the prince who had once dreamed of wearing the crown found himself begging for the mercy of a quick end. But Henry II's cruelty paled beside the institutionalized brutality of the Ottoman Empire. Here, the law itself demanded fratricide. When a new sultan ascended the throne, all his brothers, every potential rival, Every alternative heir was systematically eliminated. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones faced the silk cord, the traditional method of royal execution. Slow stagnation, eyes bulging, hands clawing at throats. The final moments stretched into an eternity of terror. Prince Mustafa, son of Suleiman the Magnificent, discovered that even being the Sultan's favorite could not protect against the poison of suspicion. Summoned to his father's tent under the pretense of reconciliation, he instead found executioners waiting with the fatal silk cord. His crime? Being too popular with the Janissaries, too capable as a general, too obvious an heir. In the Ottoman system, competence was often a death sentence. The Byzantine Empire elevated the torture of royal heirs to an art form. Emperor Basil the Macedonian ordered his own son's eyes burned out with red-hot irons, the better to ensure that the young prince could never challenge imperial authority. The procedure was conducted in the sacred chambers of the palace, turned into a religious ceremony where prayers were offered even as flesh sizzled and screams echoed of mosaic walls. But perhaps nowhere was the torture of royal heirs more systematically cruel than in the Mughal Empire of India. Shah Jahan, builder of the Taj Mahal and patron of architectural beauty, showed no such aesthetic sensibility when dealing with his rebellious sons. Prince Darashikoh, the heir apparent and a scholar of remarkable learning, was paraded through the streets of Delhi in chains, his royal robes replaced with the rags of a beggar. The humiliation was calculated. Before his execution, he had to be stripped of all dignity, all royal bearing, reduced to something less than human in the eyes of those who had once bowed before him. The psychological torture was often more devastating than the physical. In the Red Fort of Delhi, Mughal princes were kept in luxurious prisons rooms filled with silk cushions and golden cups, but barred windows and armed guards. They could see the life they should have been living, could almost touch the power that should have been theirs, but could never grasp it. Years passed, decades sometimes, as princes aged in comfortable captivity, their minds slowly fracturing under the weight of unfulfilled destiny. The most heartbreaking cases were those where love persisted despite torture. Sons who continued to write letters to the fathers who had ordered their mutilation. Princes who forgave even as they were led to execution. Their loyalty made their suffering more poignant, their torment more profound. They had remained true to the very men who had betrayed them most completely. In palaces that glittered with gold, the chains of sons rattled in the dark. There comes a moment in every tyrant's reign when the last threads of humanity snap, when the father disappears entirely, and only the monster remains. For some kings, this breaking point arrived gradually, paranoia accumulating like sediment in their souls. For others, it struck like lightning, a single moment of revelation, when they realized that mercy was weakness, that love was liability, that the only way to truly secure a throne was to be willing to sacrifice everything, even their own children. Ivan the Terrible of Russia experienced his breaking point in a fit of rage that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In November 1581, in a moment of uncontrolled fury, he struck his son and heir with a pointed staff. The blow was fatal, and as Ivan watched his son die in his arms, he realized that his paranoia had finally consumed the very thing he had been trying to protect, his dynasty itself. But Ivan's moment of regret made him an exception. Most kings who crossed this threshold never looked back. Peter the Great of Russia suspected his son Alexei of treason, and subjected him to interrogation and torture so brutal that the young prince died before he could be formally executed. Peter showed no remorse. In his mind, the death of one son was a small price to pay for the security of his empire. The psychology of these moments reveals the true horror of absolute power. These were not impersonal political calculations. These were fathers looking into the eyes of their own children and choosing the throne over blood, power over love, dynasty over family. The intimacy of the betrayal made it more devastating than any torture administered by strangers. Some kings participated directly in their sons' torment, as if the act of causing pain with their own hands was necessary to prove their commitment to power. Others watched from thrones and balconies, their presence a silent endorsement of every scream, every plea for mercy. The message was clear. No bond was stronger than the bond between king and crown. No love deeper than the love of absolute authority. The sons, meanwhile, faced their own breaking points. Some maintained their dignity even under torture, refusing to confess to crimes they had not committed, dying with royal bearing intact. Others broke completely, begging for forgiveness, promising loyalty, offering anything and everything for just one more day of life. Both responses were tragic in their own way, the first because it was futile, the second because it was so utterly human. The most chilling cases were those where the torture became a family affair. Wives forced to watch their husbands tortured, brothers pitted against brothers, mothers compelled to choose between their sons and their husbands. The palace became a theater of systematic cruelty where every relationship was poisoned, every trust violated, every love corrupted. And when the last shred of mercy died, the true horror began. The private torture chambers were only the beginning. Once a king had decided that his son must be broken, the next step was often to make that breaking a public spectacle. The message had to be broadcast beyond palace walls. Even royal blood could be spilled. Even divine lineage could be humiliated. Even the most privileged heirs were subject to their father's absolute will. The public execution of royal heirs served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the king's power to nobles who might be considering rebellion. It showed common people that no one was above royal justice. Most importantly, it transformed personal betrayal into state theater, making the intimate act of destroying one's own child into a public affirmation of absolute monarchy. Charles I of England learned this lesson too late. When he finally faced his own execution, he understood that the spectacle was as important as the act itself. The crowds that gathered in Whitehall were not there merely to witness death. They were there to see the symbolic transfer of power, the public humiliation of divine right, the theatrical destruction of royal authority. But Charles was an amateur compared to the masters of public royal humiliation who had come before him. In the squares of Constantinople, Byzantine princes were paraded before jeering crowds, their royal robes stripped away, their heads shaved, their dignity systematically destroyed before their lives were taken. The crowds were encouraged to participate, to throw refuse, to shout insults, to join in the collective repudiation of a royal heir who had forgotten his place. The most elaborate public humiliations were reserved for the most spectacular betrayals. When Mughal Prince Dara Shikoh was finally captured by his brother Aurangzeb, he was not simply executed. Instead, he was displayed like a trophy, paraded through the streets of Delhi on a diseased elephant, his royal turban replaced with a beggar's cap, his princely garments exchanged for the rags of a commoner. The crowds that had once cheered his name now witnessed his ultimate degradation. The psychology of these public spectacles reveals something profound about the nature of royal power. A king's authority was not simply political or military, it was theatrical. The crown had to be seen to be legitimate, and that legitimacy was often best demonstrated through the public destruction of alternative claimants. Every cheer from the crowd was a vote of confidence in the reigning monarch. Every jeer at the disgraced prince a rejection of his claim to divine authority. Some heirs maintained their dignity even in these moments of ultimate humiliation. They walked to their deaths with heads held high, refusing to give their tormentors the satisfaction of seeing them broken. Their courage in these final moments sometimes redeemed them in the eyes of history, transforming them from failed rebels into tragic heroes. Others collapsed completely under the weight of public shame. These princes wept and begged, offered confessions and apologies, promised anything for mercy that would never come. Their final moments became cautionary tales, examples of what happened when royal heirs forgot their duty and challenged their father's authority. The crowd cheered, the throne stood firm, but the bloodline fractured forever. The great irony of royal filicide was that it rarely achieved its intended purpose. Kings who tortured and killed their sons to preserve their dynasties often hastened their very destruction. The paranoia that drove them to eliminate their heirs also drove away their allies, corrupted their judgment, and weakened the very foundations of their power. The Ottoman Empire, which had institutionalized the murder of royal brothers, began its long decline precisely when this system reached its logical conclusion. Sultans who eliminated all potential rivals often found themselves without capable heirs, their thrones passing to weak or incompetent sons who had survived only because they posed no threat. The empire that had once struck fear into the hearts of European monarchs gradually crumbled, its strength sapped by generations of systematic fratricide. The Byzantine Empire tells a similar tale. Emperor after emperor blinded, castrated or murdered their sons and brothers, believing that elimination of rivals would secure their reigns. Instead, they created a succession of weak, isolated rulers who lacked the family support networks that had once been the backbone of imperial power. When the Ottoman Turks finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, they were not facing a mighty empire, but the hollow shell of one weakened by centuries of internal cannibalism. The personal cost to these royal killers was often as devastating as the political consequences. Ivan the Terrible, after murdering his son in a fit of rage, spent his final years tormented by guilt and madness. Contemporary accounts describe him wandering his palace at night, calling out his dead son's name, seeking forgiveness that would never come. The throne he had killed to protect became a prison of his own making. Peter the Great, who had tortured his son Alexei to death, found that his victory over potential rebellion had left him without a clear succession. His remaining heirs were weak, and his death plunged Russia into decades of instability as various claimants fought for the crown he had thought he was securing. The psychological damage extended beyond the immediate royal family. Courts that had witnessed fathers torture sons became places of perpetual suspicion and fear. Nobles learned that no relationship was sacred, no bond unbreakable, no loyalty guaranteed. The very foundation of feudal society, the trust between lord and vassal, parent and child, was corroded by the acid of royal paranoia. Foreign enemies often benefited from these internal conflicts. While kings were busy torturing their own sons, rival nations were building alliances, strengthening their armies and preparing for conquest. The energy that should have been devoted to defending the realm was instead wasted on family conflicts that weakened everyone involved. Perhaps most tragically, the torture of royal heirs often eliminated the very people who might have been capable rulers. Prince Darashikar was a scholar and a moderate who might have led the Mughal Empire toward religious tolerance and intellectual flowering. Instead, he was murdered by his fanatical brother Aurangzeb, whose brutal reign marked the beginning of Mughal decline. The empire survived Aurangzeb, but it never recovered its former glory. The throne was saved for a moment, but the kingdom itself was lost in the end. The kings who tortured their sons believed they were securing their legacies. Instead, they ensured that their names would be remembered not for their achievements, but for their betrayals. History has forgotten many of their victories, but it remembers every scream that echoed through their palace corridors. The motivations were always the same: fear masquerading as pragmatism, paranoia disguised as political necessity, personal insecurity dressed up as divine duty. These were not monsters born, but monsters made, transformed by the corrupting influence of absolute power into creatures capable of destroying their own blood. Yet the ghost of this ancient paranoia still haunts the corridors of power today. In presidential palaces and corporate boardrooms, in family businesses and political dynasties, the same dynamics play out in subtler, but no less destructive ways. The weapons may have changed: financial ruin instead of physical torture, social exile instead of literal execution, but the underlying psychology remains the same. The ultimate tragedy is not that kings were capable of such cruelty toward their sons, but that they convinced themselves it was necessary. They created elaborate justifications, wrapped their betrayals in the language of duty and divine right, transformed personal weakness into political virtue. The human capacity for self-deception, when combined with absolute power, proved capable of justifying any atrocity. The sons who died in those palace dungeons were not just victims of their father's cruelty, they were casualties of a system that demanded the impossible. How could any heir be simultaneously loyal and ambitious, respectful and capable, submissive and strong enough to eventually rule? The contradiction was built into the very structure of hereditary monarchy, a paradox that claimed lives across centuries and continents. Today, we tell ourselves that we have evolved beyond such barbarism, that our democratic institutions and constitutional protections have made such horrors impossible. But power still corrupts, fear still drives irrational decisions, and parents still sometimes see their children as threats rather than treasures. The names and methods change, but the human heart remains as capable of darkness as it ever was. In every palace, even today, power still whispers that blood is expendable, that family is secondary to authority, that love must always go before ambition. The ghosts of tortured princes walk these halls, still reminding us that the price of power is often paid not by enemies, but by those who loved us most. History remembers their crowns, but it also remembers their sons' screams.